Caleb and Cameron Wright had learned early that the world wasn't kind to boys who wore patched clothes and pushed squeaky carts through snow. But when they spotted the stranded Rolls-Royce on that frozen highway with its frustrated billionaire owner inside, the twins faced a decision that would test everything their mother had taught them about doing what's right, even when you had every reason to walk away. And what happened next in those 15 minutes of changing a tire would set in motion events that neither two poor teenage boys nor one of the richest men in America could have ever predicted, because Calvin Langston had no idea that those two boys in torn gloves were about to save far more than his evening. They were about to save his entire life. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The late afternoon sky hung heavy and gray over the rural highway, promising more snow before nightfall. A bitter wind cut across the empty road, sending loose powder swirling in ghostly patterns. The world seemed frozen in place, silent except for the persistent squeak of worn metal wheels against cracked asphalt. Caleb and Cameron pushed their grocery cart with practiced rhythm, their shoulders hunched against the cold. At 14 years old, the twin brothers had already learned to move with purpose, to keep their heads down and their hands busy. The cart was filled with bits of copper wire, old radiators, and twisted aluminum cans, a week's worth of scavenging from the abandoned factory lot on Miller Road. "Think we got enough this time?" Cameron asked, his breath forming white clouds as he spoke. His dark brown eyes squinted against the wind, and he pulled his thin jacket tighter around his frame. Caleb counted silently in his head, calculating weights and current scrap prices. His mind worked like a calculator, always had. Maybe $60, $70 if Mr. Patterson's feeling generous. "That's still 30 short for the heater," Cameron said, his voice dropping. "Christmas is in 2 weeks. We'll figure it out." Caleb's jaw tightened with determination. "We always do." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their worn sneakers crunching through patches of ice. The brothers looked nearly identical, same height, same build, same tight curled hair peeking from under knitted caps. But those who knew them could spot the differences. Caleb was the thinker, always 3 steps ahead, always planning. Cameron was the heart, quick to laugh, quick to see the good in things even when there wasn't much good to see. "You know what I'm gonna do when we get that heater?" Cameron said suddenly, a grin breaking across his face. "I'm gonna stand right in front of it and not move for like 3 hours. Caleb laughed despite himself. "Mom's gonna make you share, you know that." "Fine. 2.5 hours then." The joke felt good, warm somehow, despite the cold biting at their exposed skin. They pushed forward, the cart's squeak becoming a kind of soundtrack to their journey. That's when they saw it. The car sat like a dark jewel against the white landscape, impossibly out of place on this forgotten stretch of highway. A Rolls-Royce Phantom, black and gleaming even in the dim light, its front end tilted at an awkward angle. One tire was completely flat, the rim nearly touching the ground. "Whoa," Cameron breathed, stopping so suddenly that Caleb nearly bumped into him. "That's a rich man's car." "That's a really rich man's car," Caleb corrected, his eyes wide. He'd seen pictures in magazines at the library, but never thought he'd encounter one in real life, especially not here in the middle of nowhere. Through the tinted windows, they could make out movement, someone inside, probably calling for help. The brothers exchanged a glance, that wordless communication they'd perfected over 14 years of being 2 halves of the same whole. "We should help," Cameron said. Caleb hesitated. "Remember what happened at the grocery store last month? Security chased us out just for looking at the nice cars in the parking lot. That was different. This guy actually needs help, or he'll think we're trying to steal something." Caleb's voice carried the weight of too many doors slammed in their faces, too many suspicious looks from shopkeepers who watched them like they were criminals just for being poor. Cameron's expression softened with understanding, but he shook his head. Mom says help if you can, not if they deserve it. What if nobody comes before dark? It's supposed to drop below freezing tonight. Caleb looked at his brother, then back at the stranded car. He knew Cameron was right. They'd been raised better than to walk past someone in trouble, no matter how many times the world had taught them that kindness wasn't always returned. "All right," he said finally. "But if he tells us to get lost, we go. No arguments." They left their cart by the roadside and approached slowly, their hands visible, their movements careful and non-threatening. It was a dance they'd learned young, how to make yourself seem smaller, less dangerous, less worthy of fear. The driver's door opened before they reached it, and a man stepped out onto the icy ground. He was in his 50s, wearing an expensive blue velvet overcoat that probably cost more than their house. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and even flustered, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to ask for anything. Calvin Langston stared at his phone screen, willing the no-signal icon to disappear. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had a merger meeting in 3 hours, investors waiting, millions of dollars hanging in the balance. And here he was, stranded on some backwoods highway because his driver had called in sick and he'd been too proud to reschedule. He looked up and saw them, 2 teenage boys in threadbare clothes, watching him from a few yards away. His first instinct was suspicion. This was how robberies started in movies, wasn't it? A setup, a distraction. "Don't touch that car," he said sharply, clutching his coat tighter. The boys stopped immediately, and the taller one, Caleb, though Calvin didn't know that yet, raised his hand slightly. "We weren't going to, sir. We just saw you were stuck and thought maybe we could help. We know how to change a tire," the other one added quickly. "We work at Henderson's auto yard sometimes. We're pretty good at it." Calvin studied them more carefully. They couldn't be more than 14, 15 at most. Their jackets were too thin for this weather, and their gloves had holes in the fingers. But their eyes were clear and direct, no shifty glances or nervous energy that might signal bad intentions. "I've already called for assistance," Calvin lied, gesturing with his useless phone. "But thank you." He turned back toward the car, intending to wait inside where it was warmer. That's when his expensive leather shoe found a patch of black ice hidden under a light dusting of snow. His feet went out from under him so fast he didn't have time to catch himself. Calvin landed hard on his hip, the impact jarring through his body, his phone skittering across the ice. "Sir!" Both boys rushed forward. Caleb reached him first, hands supporting his elbow, helping him find his footing. The boy's grip was surprisingly strong, steady. Cameron retrieved the phone, brushing snow from its cracked screen before handing it back. "You okay?" Caleb asked, genuine concern in his voice. "That was a pretty hard fall." Calvin felt his face flush hot despite the cold. Here he was, the great Calvin Langston, CEO of Langston Industries, sitting on his backside on an icy road, while 2 poor kids helped him up. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I'm fine," he muttered, accepting Caleb's help to stand. His hip throbbed, and he knew he'd have a bruise the size of a dinner plate by morning. "Thank you. You sure you don't want us to change that tire?" Cameron asked, pointing at the flat. "It's getting dark soon, and you're gonna freeze waiting out here. No offense, but that coat ain't meant for actual winter." Calvin looked at the flat tire, then at the dimming sky, then back at these 2 boys who had every reason to walk past him but hadn't. His pride warred with practicality, and for once, practicality won. "All right," he said, surprising himself. "If you really know what you're doing." The twins' faces lit up with matching grins. "We got this, sir. Promise." They moved with practiced efficiency that spoke of real experience, not just youthful confidence. Cameron located the spare tire and jack in the trunk, while Caleb examined the flat, running his fingers along the rubber to find the puncture. Looks like you hit a nail or something, Caleb said. Went right through. Lucky it didn't blow out while you were driving fast. Calvin watched as they worked, their movements synchronized like they'd done this 100 times before. Caleb positioned the jack with precision while Cameron loosened the lug nuts, both of them communicating with nods and small gestures, more than words. "You boys do this often?" Calvin asked, partly to fill the silence, partly because he was genuinely curious. "Whenever Mr. Henderson needs extra hands," Cameron answered, grunting as he pulled off the flat tire. "He lets us practice on the junkers, says we got natural talent. Our dad taught us the basics before he passed," Caleb added quietly, fitting the spare tire onto the hub. "He said a man who can fix things will never be useless." Calvin felt something tighten in his chest. "I'm sorry about your father." "It's been 2 years," Cameron said, his voice steady but soft. "We miss him, but we're doing okay. Got each other. Got Mom and our little sister. Your mother must be proud of you." The twins exchanged another one of those wordless looks. Caleb tightened the last lug nut before responding. "She tells us that. Even when we mess up, she says she's proud. We're trying to make sure she's right." They lowered the car and tested the tire, making sure everything was secure. The whole process had taken maybe 15 minutes, and they'd done it better than most professional mechanics Calvin had watched. "That should get you where you're going," Caleb said, wiping his hands on his already dirty jeans. "You'll want to get a real tire put on soon, though. Spares aren't meant for long distances." Calvin reached for his wallet, pulling out several bills. $500, more than enough to show his gratitude. He held it out toward them. Both boys took a step back. "That's okay, sir," Caleb said quickly. "We didn't help for money." "But you did help," Calvin insisted, confusion creasing his brow. "And you clearly could use it." Cameron shook his head, that easy smile still on his face despite the obvious poverty written in every worn seam of his clothes. "That's not why we stopped. Wouldn't feel right taking payment for doing what anybody should do." Calvin stood there, money in hand, feeling suddenly small despite his height and wealth. In his world, everything had a price. Everything was a transaction. These boys had just flipped that world upside down. "At least let me give you something," he tried again. "Gas money, food money, something." "We're good," Caleb said firmly but politely. "But thank you for offering." "Really?" They were already backing away, heading toward their cart of scrap metal. Calvin watched them go. These 2 kids in torn gloves who'd helped a stranger and refused payment, who'd shown more integrity in 15 minutes than most of his business associates showed in a lifetime. "Wait," he called out. "What are your names?" The twins turned back. "I'm Caleb, he's Cameron," the taller one said. "Caleb and Cameron Wright." "Calvin," he replied. "Calvin Langston." Recognition flickered across Cameron's face. "Like the Langston Industries guy? We seen your buildings downtown." Calvin nodded slowly. The boys didn't seem impressed, didn't change their demeanor at all. If anything, Cameron just looked mildly interested, the way someone might react to hearing about a distant relative's job. "Well, Mr. Langston," Caleb said, "you should probably get moving before it gets full dark. Roads get dangerous." "Thank you," Calvin said, and meant it more than they could possibly know. "Both of you." He climbed into his car, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. In his rearview mirror, he watched the twins return to their squeaking cart, watched them lean into the wind and continue their journey. He drove slowly, unable to stop glancing back until they disappeared from view. The merger meeting suddenly seemed very far away and very unimportant. By the time Caleb and Cameron reached their house, full darkness had fallen, and their fingers were numb inside their torn gloves. The Wright home sat at the end of a dirt road, small and weathered with paint peeling from the wooden siding. But smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, and that made it more welcoming than any mansion. They left the cart by the sagging porch steps and stomped snow from their shoes before entering. The interior was cramped but clean, furnished with mismatched pieces that had been old when they were new. A single space heater hummed in the corner, barely making a dent in the cold that seeped through the thin walls. "Boys, that you?" Their mother's voice came from the living room, warm and tired in equal measure. "Yes, ma'am," they called in unison, pulling off their wet jackets. Ruth Wright sat in her worn armchair, a blanket draped over her lap and another around her shoulders. At 36, she looked older, worn down by hard work and harder times. But her smile was genuine as her sons entered, and her dark eyes held nothing but love. Their little sister Zara was curled up on the couch, sleeping under a pile of blankets. At 7 years old, she'd learned to sleep through anything, including her own hunger. "How'd we do today?" Ruth asked, nodding toward the cart outside. "Maybe $60, $70. Caleb answered, settling onto the floor near her chair. "Depends on Mr. Patterson's mood." "That's good. Real good." Ruth's smile wavered slightly. They all knew it wasn't enough, would never be enough. But she wouldn't let them see her despair. "You boys eat lunch?" "We split a sandwich at noon," Cameron lied smoothly. They'd actually given most of it to old Mrs. Chen's cat, but their mother didn't need to know that. Ruth studied them with knowing eyes, but let it pass. "Well, I got dinner ready. It's not much, but it's hot." Dinner turned out to be a single can of chicken soup, watered down to make it stretch, divided into 3 bowls. Zara slept through it, which was probably a blessing. Ruth ladled out portions for her sons, then started to serve herself. "I already ate, Mama," Caleb said quickly, catching her wrist gently. "You have mine." "Caleb, please. We had those sandwiches, remember? I'm stuffed." It was a lie they'd told so many times it came out smooth as truth. Ruth's eyes glistened, but she nodded and divided Caleb's portion between herself and Cameron, who'd opened his mouth to protest but caught his brother's sharp look. They ate in companionable silence, the weak warmth of the soup spreading through their bellies. Cameron tried to lighten the mood with a story about a dog that had chased them past the factory, exaggerating the size until it sounded like a wolf. Even Ruth laughed, the sound papery, but real. After dinner, while Cameron washed the few dishes they had, Caleb noticed an envelope on the counter. His stomach sank when he recognized the school letterhead. "Mama? What's this?" Ruth's expression shifted, worry creasing her forehead. "Letter came yesterday. Didn't want to upset you boys before you went out." Caleb opened it with shaking hands and read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Wright, this letter is to inform you that Caleb and Cameron Wright have exceeded the acceptable number of absences for the semester. Continued absences may result in expulsion. Please contact the office to discuss this matter." Cameron dried his hands slowly, coming to stand beside his brother. "It's not that bad. Just says we need to talk to them." "It says expulsion, Cameron." Caleb's voice was tight. "We can't get expelled. We need those diplomas if we're ever going to get decent jobs. Then we'll go to school more," Cameron said simply. "We'll figure something else out for money." "There is nothing else." Caleb's voice rose, frustration bleeding through. "The junkyard is the only place that'll hire us without working papers. School doesn't heat the house. School doesn't buy medicine when Mama needs it." "Boys," Ruth said softly but firmly, "stop." They fell silent immediately, twin expressions of guilt crossing their faces. They never yelled, not at each other, not in front of their mother. Ruth pulled herself up from her chair with visible effort, moving to stand between her sons. She placed a hand on each of their cheeks, her palms rough from years of cleaning houses and taking in laundry. "I know things are hard," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I know you're doing everything you can to help this family. But your education is your way out of this. It's the ladder up, you understand. I won't let you sacrifice your future to fix my present. But Mama, Caleb started. No buts. We'll make do. We always have, haven't we? The Lord provides, even when we can't see how. She pulled them both into a hug, and they towered over her now. But in that moment, they were small children again, safe in their mother's arms. She released them and returned to her chair, bowing her head. Lord, she prayed aloud, her voice carrying through the small house. Thank you for these two good sons who never gave up on being kind. Thank you for keeping us together, for keeping us strong. Help us find our way through these hard times. And please, let my boys know that grades can't warm a house, but hearts that never stop learning can light up the world. Amen. Amen, the twins echoed quietly. That night, sharing a narrow mattress in their tiny room, Caleb stared at the ceiling, while Cameron's breathing slowly evened out beside him. His mind raced, calculating and recalculating, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. They needed $300 for heating oil to last the winter. They needed money for Ruth's medicine. They needed to keep Zara fed and in school. And they needed to stay in school themselves, somehow. The memory of the billionaires offered money burned in his mind. $500. More than enough. But taking it would have felt wrong, like they'd only helped because they wanted something in return. Their father had taught them better than that. We did the right thing today, didn't we? Cameron's voice came through the darkness, not quite asleep after all. Yeah, Caleb answered. We did. Then why does it feel like we keep losing? Caleb had no answer for that. Across town, in a mansion that sprawled across 5 acres of manicured grounds, Calvin Langston sat in a leather chair before a fireplace that could have warmed the Wright family's entire house. The merger meeting had gone well. He'd secured the deal, added another $100 million to his portfolio. His assistant had briefed him on stock reports, market trends, quarterly projections. But his mind kept returning to that frozen highway, to 2 boys who'd helped a stranger and asked for nothing. He thought of his own son, Ethan, who he hadn't spoken to in 6 months. Their last conversation had ended in a shouting match about trust funds and responsibility, about Ethan's entitled attitude and Calvin's obsession with money over family. The words still stung. Those boys today had more maturity, more integrity in their torn gloves than his son had with every advantage Calvin could provide. The realization hurt more than the bruise on his hip. Calvin stood and walked to his office, pulling up information on his computer. Caleb and Cameron Wright. It didn't take long to find them. The town wasn't that big. Father deceased, mother working multiple jobs, living at the edge of poverty. They'd saved him from a miserable night on that highway. Meanwhile, his own fortune sat in banks and investments, doing nothing but growing larger while kids like that scraped by on soup and scrap metal. He made a call to his assistant. Julie, I need you to put together a package for me. Discreetly. Food, winter supplies, maybe a decent heater. Yes, I'll send you the address. It wasn't enough. He knew that. But it was something. The next morning arrived bitter and gray. Caleb and Cameron woke before dawn, as always preparing for school. But first, they had promised old Mr. Burton they'd shovel his walk for $10. Every little bit counted. They worked quickly, their breath fogging in the pre-dawn darkness, their muscles warming with the effort. Mr. Burton paid them with shaking hands, adding an extra $5 because, he said, they'd done such a fine job. At school they kept their heads down, ignored the whispers. Some kids knew they were poor, knew they wore the same clothes week after week. The twins had learned not to care, or at least not to show that they cared. But that afternoon, walking home through fresh snow, Cameron saw something that made him stop dead. Caleb, look. On their porch sat boxes, lots of boxes, grocery bags filled with food, a large space heater still in its packaging, blankets, new and warm. The twins ran the last 100 yards, nearly slipping on ice in their hurry. Ruth stood in the doorway, Zara peeking around her legs, both of them staring at the unexpected bounty. "Who?" was all Caleb could say. Ruth shook her head, holding up a blank card. "No name. Just this." Cameron opened the card and read the single-typed line. "For a family that deserves warmth." The boys looked at each other. They knew. Somehow. They knew. "The man from yesterday," Caleb breathed. They brought everything inside, and for the first time in months their house felt truly warm. The anonymous gifts had brought warmth and relief to the Wright household, but questions lingered in the cold morning air. Caleb stood at the frosted window, watching steam rise from his mug of hot chocolate. Real hot chocolate, not the watered-down powder they usually made do with. The new heater hummed steadily in the corner, and for the first time in months he'd woken up without seeing his breath in the bedroom. Cameron joined him at the window, their shoulders touching in that unconscious way twins have. "You really think it was him?" he asked quietly, not wanting to wake Zara, who was still bundled on the couch. "Who else could it be? We don't know anybody with that kind of money." "Maybe he felt guilty," Cameron offered. "Rich people sometimes do charity stuff, right?" Before Caleb could respond, a deep rumble echoed from outside. Both boys froze. They knew that sound, the powerful purr of an expensive engine, the kind you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. They pressed their faces to the window, breath fogging the glass. Through the early morning mist, a black Rolls-Royce rolled to a stop at their front gate, looking as out of place as a diamond in a coal pile. "Oh no," Caleb whispered. "We scratched it. We must have scratched it when we changed the tire." "We were careful," Cameron protested, but his voice carried doubt. "Weren't we?" "Rich folks don't visit twice unless something's wrong." Caleb was already moving toward the door, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Maybe he wants money for repairs. Maybe he thinks we tried to steal something. They burst outside without jackets, the cold hitting them like a slap. The car door opened, and Calvin stepped out wearing the same blue velvet overcoat from before. But something about him seemed different today, softer around the eyes, less guarded in his posture. "Boys," he said, a slight smile on his face. "Good morning." "Mr. Langston," Caleb started, words tumbling out. "If we damaged your car, we didn't mean to. We can work it off, whatever it costs. We're good workers, honest." Calvin raised a hand, his smile widening. "The car is fine. Better than fine. You two did excellent work." The twins exchanged confused glances. Cameron spoke up. "Then why are you here, sir?" "Because I owe you more than you realize." The front door creaked open behind them. Ruth appeared, wrapped in her robe, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. She took in the scene. Her sons in their socks on the frozen ground, the billionaire at her gate. And something clicked in her understanding. "You're the man they helped," she said simply. Calvin nodded. "I am. And you must be their mother. Mrs. Wright, I wonder if I might come inside for a moment." Ruth hesitated, suddenly conscious of their humble home, the peeling paint, the crooked steps. But hospitality was bred into her bones, deeper than pride. "Of course. Boys, get inside before you catch your death." The interior felt even smaller with Calvin in it. He stood in the center of their living room, his expensive coat a splash of color against the faded furniture. His eyes took in everything. The new heater still running, the boxes of food partially unpacked in the kitchen, the thin walls that barely held back the cold. Zara peeked out from behind the couch, her big eyes wide with curiosity. Mama, is that the angel man from my dream? Hush now, baby, Ruth said gently, but she was watching Calvin carefully, trying to read his intentions. Calvin reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. He held it out to Ruth with both hands, a gesture of respect. Mrs. Wright, I'd like to offer you this, a token of gratitude for what your sons did. Ruth's hands stayed at her sides. Mr. Langston, that's very kind, but we can't accept money. My boys didn't help you looking for a reward. I know that. That's exactly why you deserve it. Calvin's voice was earnest, almost pleading. Please, you have no idea what their kindness meant to me that day. Ruth shook her head slowly, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. We don't take charity, sir. We may be poor, but we have our dignity. This isn't charity, Calvin began, but Caleb cut him off. Mr. Langston, can I ask you something? Of course. Did you send all that stuff yesterday? The food, the heater, everything? Calvin met his eyes and nodded. I did. That's real generous of you, Caleb continued, choosing his words carefully. And we appreciate it more than you know. But if you really want to thank us, if you really want to help, he glanced at his mother, saw her weakness hidden beneath her strength. Help Mom get a checkup. She hasn't seen a doctor in over a year. Ruth's eyes went wide. Caleb, no, that's too much to ask. Mama, you fainted last week. You think we didn't notice you skipping meals? Cameron's voice cracked slightly. Please, just let him help with this. Calvin looked between the three of them. Two teenage boys trying to save their mother, a mother trying to protect her sons from feeling helpless. His throat tightened with emotion he hadn't felt in years. My car is right outside, he said quietly. We can go right now. 40 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of St. Mary's Medical Center. The staff at the reception desk did a double-take when Calvin Langston walked through the doors, but their professionalism quickly kicked in. When he explained that Mrs. Wright needed to be seen immediately, nurses appeared with wheelchairs and paperwork. Ruth tried to protest. She could walk just fine, she wasn't that sick. But the boys insisted, and Calvin supported them. She was taken back for examination while the three of them sat in the waiting room, an unlikely trio united by concern. Your mother is a strong woman, Calvin said, watching the twins fidget with nervous energy. Strongest person we know, Cameron agreed. She works 3 jobs and never complains. Not once. 4 now, Caleb corrected. She picked up laundry from the motel on weekends. Calvin felt that familiar shame creeping back, the one that had plagued him since meeting these boys. Here was a woman working herself to death while he debated which of his 3 vacation homes to visit. The contrast was obscene. Your father, he said carefully. What did he do? He was a mechanic, Caleb answered. Good one, too. Everybody said so. He taught us everything we know about fixing things. Heart attack took him, Cameron added, his voice flat with old grief. Right there in the garage. He was only 38. They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. An hour passed, then another. Finally, a doctor emerged, calling for the Wright family. The news was worse than they'd hoped, but not as bad as they'd feared. Ruth's diabetes had gone untreated for too long, and her blood sugar levels were dangerously high. She needed medication, regular monitoring, and better nutrition. The doctor's expression was grave as he explained the risks of continued neglect. Calvin listened to every word, watching the twins' faces cycle through fear and determination. When the doctor finished and left to write prescriptions, Calvin made a decision. I'll cover all of it, he said firmly. The medications, the follow-up appointments, everything. Mr. Langston, we can't let you. Ruth began from her examination bed, but Calvin shook his head. You can and you will. Not because you owe me anything, but because I'm asking you to let me do this. He looked at Caleb and, Cameron, your boys reminded me what true character looks like. They gave me something I'd lost. The least I can do is make sure they don't lose their mother." Tears streamed down Ruth's face. The boys stood on either side of her bed, holding her hands. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Ruth nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you, Mr. Langston." The drive back to their house was quiet but peaceful. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape golden. Calvin pulled up to their gate and shifted the car into park, but didn't immediately get out. "Your father would be proud of you both," he said, looking at the twins in the rearview mirror. "I hope you know that." Caleb stared out the window, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Cameron managed a small, "Thank you, sir." As they climbed out of the car, Calvin called to them one more time. "Expect a visitor tomorrow. Someone from my company." The twins exchanged puzzled looks but nodded. They helped their mother inside, supporting her weight between them. Calvin watched until they were safely through the door, then drove away slowly, his taillights fading in the winter afternoon. Inside, Ruth settled into her chair with her new medications on the side table. Zara climbed into her lap, and the boys sat at her feet, the four of them forming a tight circle of gratitude and hope. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Ruth murmured, stroking Zara's hair. "Sends angels in Rolls-Royces when you least expect it." That night, the Wright family slept soundly, warm and fed and together. But across town, in his mansion office, Calvin was making phone calls and drafting plans. The wheels of something larger had begun to turn. The next morning arrived with a knock at the door. Caleb answered to find a man in a sharp business suit carrying a leather briefcase. He was young, maybe 30, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning. I'm looking for Caleb and Cameron Wright." "That's us," Cameron said, appearing behind his brother. "You the visitor Mr. Langston mentioned?" "Indeed. My name is Gerald Foster from Langston Industries Corporate Relations. May I come in?" The twins led him to the small kitchen table. Ruth watched from her chair, Zara on her lap again, both of them silent observers. Gerald opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Mr. Langston was very impressed with you boys," Gerald began, his voice smooth and practiced. "He'd like to show his gratitude in a more substantial way. We're offering you a position as youth ambassadors for our new charitable initiative." "Youth ambassadors," Caleb repeated slowly. "What does that mean exactly?" Gerald spread papers across the table, pointing to various sections. "It's quite simple. You'd represent the company at charity events, appear in promotional materials, share your story of helping Mr. Langston. In return, you'd receive a generous stipend, college fund contributions, and full medical coverage for your family." It sounded too good to be true. Cameron's face lit up with excitement, but Caleb leaned forward, actually reading the contract. His eyes moved carefully over the dense legal language, and with each paragraph, his frown deepened. "This says we give you permission to use our names, images, and personal story for marketing purposes," Caleb said, his finger tracing a particular section. "It says we have to attend events, do interviews, pose for photographs, basically become the face of your charity campaign." "Well, yes," Gerald agreed cheerfully. "That's what an ambassadorship entails. You'd be helping us spread awareness about kindness and community service. Think of all the good you could do." Cameron looked ready to sign, but Caleb caught his arm. "Can we have some time to think about it?" Gerald's smile tightened slightly. "Of course. But Mr. Langston is hoping for an answer today. This is a time-sensitive opportunity." After Gerald left, promising to return in a few hours, the family gathered for a discussion. Cameron was enthusiastic. The money would solve all their problems, set them up for years. But Caleb remained skeptical. "Something feels wrong about it," he said, pacing their small living room. Why do they need our pictures? Why do they need us at events? If they want to give money to charity, can't they just do it? Maybe they need a story people can connect with, Cameron argued. What's wrong with that? It turns us into a story, not people. We become the poor kids who help the rich man, like some kind of fairy tale they can sell. Ruth had been listening quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, both boys stopped and paid attention. Remember what your daddy used to say? If it costs your dignity, it's not a gift. But Mama, think about what we could do with that money, Cameron pleaded. Your medicine, Zara's school, college for us. At what price? Ruth asked gently. You think having your faces on billboards, being trotted out like show ponies at fancy events, you think that's living with dignity? Or is that just a different kind of poverty? Caleb felt relief wash through him. His mother understood what he'd been struggling to articulate. We did a good thing because it was the right thing to do, not to get famous from it. When Gerald returned that afternoon, the twins were waiting on the porch. Their answer was simple and final. No. Gerald's professional mask slipped, revealing irritation beneath. You're making a mistake. Do you have any idea how many people would jump at this opportunity? Then offer it to them, Caleb said firmly. We're not interested in being your poster children. Mr. Langston will be disappointed. If he is, then we were wrong about him, Cameron added, finding his conviction. We helped because he needed help, not because we wanted to be in commercials. Gerald packed his briefcase with sharp, angry movements. Don't come crying to us when your mother can't afford her next doctor's visit. He left without another word, his car kicking up gravel as he sped away. Ruth came outside and put an arm around each of her sons. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. Both of you. But that night, lying in their shared bed, doubt crept in. What if they'd made the wrong choice? What if pride really did go before a fall? What if their mother's health deteriorated because they'd refused help? You awake? Cameron whispered into the darkness. Yeah. Did we mess up? Caleb was silent for a long moment. I don't know. But I know Dad would have said no too. They took comfort in that, small as it was. The following week brought unexpected consequences. Somehow word spread about their refusal. Rumors twisted and multiplied in the small town. Some neighbors began whispering that the Wrights had lied about their poverty, that they'd turned down charity because they were secretly rich. Others accused them of being ungrateful, of biting the hand that fed them. At school it got worse. Kids who'd ignored them before now openly mocked them. Too good for money? One boy sneered in the hallway. Must be nice being fake poor. Cameron got into a fight defending Caleb when 3 older kids surrounded him, calling them con artists. It took 2 teachers to pull them apart. Cameron had a split lip and a suspension. Caleb had a black eye and guilt that sat heavier than any bruise. The principal, Mrs. Davidson, was a stern woman who'd seen too many troubled kids pass through her office. She listened to their side of the story with skeptical eyes. Violence is never the answer, Mr. Wright, she said to Cameron. You're suspended for 3 days. And given your attendance record, I strongly suggest you both reconsider your priorities before it's too late. Ruth tried to advocate for them, explaining the circumstances, but bureaucracy ground forward with indifferent momentum. Rules were rules. Consequences were consequences. That evening, as the twins sat at the kitchen table doing homework by lamplight, another knock came at the door. This time, no businessman waited outside. Just an envelope, lying on the porch mat. Caleb opened it with shaking hands and pulled out a single piece of stationery, expensive paper with a simple message written in elegant handwriting. Sometimes the world won't understand your goodness. Don't stop being good. C.L. Calvin Langston. The man himself, not his corporate representatives. Cameron read the note over his brother's shoulder, and something tight in his chest loosened. They hadn't been wrong. The test hadn't been about accepting or refusing the offer. It had been about staying true to themselves, regardless of the consequences. He was testing us, Caleb breathed, understanding dawning. That Gerald guy, the contract, all of it. He wanted to see if we meant what we said about not helping for money. Did we pass? Cameron asked. Caleb looked at the note again, at the elegant signature, at the words that felt like a blessing. Yeah, he said softly. I think we did. Ruth took the note from them and read it slowly, her eyes misty. She pressed it to her chest and looked up at the ceiling, lips moving in silent prayer. When she looked back at her sons, her expression was peaceful. Your reward's coming, she said with quiet certainty. Maybe not the way you expect, maybe not when you want it. But it's coming. Good soil always bears fruit, even when the winter seems endless. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white. Inside the small Wright home, a family that had passed through fire without burning, held each other close, their integrity intact, their hope renewed, waiting to see what tomorrow would bring. Calvin's handwritten note had given the Wright family renewed hope, but the world outside their small home remained cold and unforgiving. Monday morning arrived with fresh snow and fresh challenges. Caleb and Cameron walked to school through the white-blanketed streets, carrying the donated backpacks that had appeared on their porch weeks ago. The weight on their shoulders came less from books than from the stares they knew awaited them. Think people will still be talking? Cameron asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Probably, Caleb answered honestly. People love a good story, especially when they get to be the ones judging it. Cameron adjusted his backpack straps and forced a grin. Maybe Mr. Langston stands for Mr. Reindeer, and he's actually Santa. That would explain the mysterious gifts. Despite everything, Caleb laughed. His brother had a gift for finding light in dark places. Santa drives a sleigh, not a Rolls-Royce. Upgraded for efficiency. Reindeer kept asking for dental coverage. They were still chuckling when they reached the schoolyard. The laughter died quickly. Clusters of students turned to stare, some whispering behind their hands, others pointing outright. The twins kept their heads up and walked toward the entrance with as much dignity as they could muster. In homeroom, their teacher, Mrs. Patterson, no relation to the scrapyard owner, noticed their improved participation. For the first time in months, both boys stayed awake through the entire lesson, asked questions, took notes. The cloud of exhaustion that usually hung over them had lifted slightly, just enough to let their natural intelligence shine through. Nice to have you both back with us, Mrs. Patterson said quietly as class ended. You're both bright boys. Don't let circumstances steal that from you. Yes, ma'am, they replied in unison, gathering their books. Lunch was harder. The cafeteria buzzed with the particular kind of energy that came from gossip, well-fed and thriving. Caleb and Cameron sat at their usual table in the corner, the one nobody wanted because it was near the trash cans and smelled faintly of sour milk. Heard they turned down like $1 million, someone said loudly from 2 tables over. My mom says they're probably running some kind of scam. Or they're just stupid, another voice added, followed by laughter. Cameron's jaw tightened, but Caleb placed a hand on his arm. Not worth it, he murmured. Let them talk. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who got suspended for fighting. You were fighting for me. That makes it my responsibility, too. They ate in silence after that, focusing on the subsidized lunch that tasted like cardboard but filled their stomachs. Across the cafeteria, a few students watched them with different expressions. Not mockery, but curiosity, maybe even admiration. The twins didn't notice. They'd learned to keep their eyes on their plates and their business to themselves. Meanwhile, across town in his glass and steel office tower, Calvin sat through a board meeting that felt increasingly pointless. The executives droned on about quarterly earnings, market shares, projected growth, numbers on screens, percentages, and pie charts, all representing money that would make more money without anyone actually doing anything meaningful. "Mr. Langston?" His CFO's voice cut through his thoughts. "Your opinion on the layoff proposal?" Calvin blinked, refocusing on the presentation. 500 jobs eliminated to improve the bottom line. 500 families affected so his shareholders could see their portfolios grow by another 2%. "What happens to those 500 people?" he asked quietly. The CFO looked confused. "Sir, after we lay them off, what happens to them? Do we help them find new work, provide severance beyond the legal minimum, offer job training?" Uncomfortable glances passed between the board members. This wasn't how Calvin usually conducted meetings. He was known for being ruthless, efficient, focused purely on results, so "We provide the standard severance package," the CFO offered. 2 weeks per year of service, as per the employment contracts. Calvin thought of Ruth Wright working 4 jobs to keep her family afloat. He thought of 2 teenage boys who'd rather push carts of scrap metal through snow than compromise their integrity. He thought about what his empire was actually built on, the backs of people he never saw, never knew, never cared about. "Table the layoffs," he said abruptly. "I want alternative cost-cutting measures by Friday, ones that don't involve putting families on the street before Christmas." The room fell silent. Finally, his COO spoke up. "Sir, the shareholders are expecting—" "The shareholders will get their returns," Calvin cut him off, "just not at the cost of people's livelihoods." Meeting adjourned. He left the boardroom, ignoring the stunned faces behind him. His assistant Julie hurried to catch up, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "Mr. Langston, is everything all right? You seem different lately." Calvin stopped at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Somewhere down there, in the parts of town that never appeared in tourist brochures, the Wright family was living their lives with more grace than anyone in this building could comprehend. "I met some kids who reminded me why I built this company in the first place," he said softly. "Somewhere along the way I forgot. I'm trying to remember." That evening, back in his mansion, Calvin sat in his study reviewing documents. But his mind kept wandering to a small wooden house with thin walls and a squeaky heater. On impulse, he picked up his phone and called his son. Ethan answered on the 4th ring, his voice wary. "Dad, is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to talk." A long pause. "You never just want to talk." Calvin winced at the truth of it. "I know. I'm sorry for that. How have you been?" They talked for 20 minutes. Awkward, halting conversation that felt like learning a foreign language. But it was a start. When Calvin finally hung up, he felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had shifted slightly. He made another call, this one to a local newspaper reporter he knew. "David, Calvin Langston. I want to make an announcement about a new charitable initiative. No, not through the corporate PR department. Something personal. Can we meet?" The next morning, the Wright household woke to a surprise. Grocery deliveries had become regular now, appearing on their porch every few days with no sender information. But today was different. Today brought winter coats, real ones with thick insulation and waterproof shells. There were 4 of them, sized perfectly for each family member. Ruth held up the smallest coat, meant for Zara, and tears streaked down her cheeks. "Who is this man?" she whispered. "What kind of person does all this?" "A good one, Mama," Cameron said, trying on his coat. It fit perfectly, warm and sturdy. Maybe the only rich person who remembers what it's like to be cold. Caleb was quieter, turning his coat over in his hands, examining the quality. This wasn't cheap charity store merchandise. These were expensive coats, the kind that lasted years. He thought about Calvin's note. Don't stop being good, and wondered what the billionaire was planning. At school that day, wearing their new coats, the twins faced a different kind of attention. Jealousy mixed with the mockery now. Where were they getting this stuff? Who was their mysterious benefactor? The rumors grew wilder. They'd blackmailed Calvin Langston. They'd found some illegal way to extort him. They were running a con game. Mrs. Patterson pulled them aside after class. "Boys, I don't know your situation, and I won't pry. But I want you to know something." She glanced around to make sure they were alone. "The world often punishes people for having integrity. It's easier to tear down than to build up. Don't let them make you ashamed of doing the right thing." "Thank you, ma'am," Caleb said, genuinely moved. "And Caleb, I'm recommending you both for the academic honors track next semester. Your test scores are exceptional. You belong there." The twins walked home in stunned silence, processing this unexpected validation. The cold didn't bite as hard in their new coats, and somehow that simple comfort made everything else seem more bearable. Meanwhile, Calvin was making moves that would ripple far beyond one struggling family. He'd spent the morning at the county clerk's office, then visited 3 abandoned properties in the Wright family's neighborhood. By afternoon, he'd purchased all 3 and hired a construction company to begin renovations. His assistant Julie reviewed the paperwork with growing confusion. "Sir, these buildings are in terrible condition. The renovation costs will exceed the property values by millions. This makes no financial sense." "Good thing I'm not doing it for financial reasons, then," Calvin replied, signing the last document with a flourish. "May I ask what you are doing it for?" Calvin looked up at her, and Julie was struck by how different he seemed. The hardness around his eyes had softened. He looked younger somehow, despite the gray in his hair. "I'm building something that matters," he said simply. "For once in my life, I'm building something that actually matters." That evening, as the Wright family finished dinner, a real meal of chicken and vegetables thanks to the mysterious groceries, a series of car engines rumbled outside. Not just one this time, but several. The twins rushed to the window and their jaws dropped. Outside sat the familiar black Rolls-Royce, but behind it was a convoy of trucks and vans. Men in work clothes were unloading equipment, lumber, tools. And standing in the middle of it all, directing traffic like a conductor leading an orchestra, was Calvin Langston. "What in the world?" Ruth breathed, joining her sons at the window. They rushed outside, not even bothering with their new coats in their hurry. The cold hit them immediately, but they barely noticed. Calvin turned as they approached, and the smile on his face was genuine and wide. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said warmly. "Mrs. Wright, I hope we're not disturbing your dinner." "Mr. Langston, what is all this?" Caleb asked, gesturing at the organized chaos surrounding their home. Calvin's eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement. "This is the beginning of something important. Boys, I've been doing a lot of thinking since we met, about wealth, about purpose, about what legacy actually means." He gestured for them to follow him down the street to the nearest abandoned building, an old warehouse that had been empty for years. Workers were already clearing debris from inside, and portable lights illuminated the space. "I'm building a community repair workshop," Calvin announced, his voice carrying over the noise. "A place where young people can learn skills, automotive repair, carpentry, electrical work, plumbing, free training, paid, apprenticeships, job placement assistance." Cameron's eyes went wide. "Like a school?" "Better than a school. A pathway. A way for kids in this neighborhood to learn trades that will support them for life." Calvin turned to face them directly. "And I want to name it after you two. The Wright Brothers Initiative." "No," Caleb said immediately, shaking his head. "No, sir, we can't." Calvin's face fell slightly. "Why not?" "Because we don't want fame," Caleb explained, his voice firm but respectful. "We don't want to be the face of anything. That's why we turned down the ambassador thing. We just want to help, Cameron added, not be celebrities. Calvin studied them for a long moment, then slowly knelt down until he was at their eye level. The gesture surprised them. This powerful man making himself physically smaller, showing respect through posture. Then you'll be the reason it works, he said softly. Not the faces in the photos, but the inspiration behind it. The reminder of why I'm doing this. Is that acceptable? The twins looked at each other, communicating in that wordless way they had. Finally, Caleb nodded. Yes, sir. That's acceptable. Ruth, who had been watching silently with Zara clinging to her leg, stepped forward. Her voice was thick with emotion. Mr. Langston, I don't understand. Why are you doing all this for us? We're nobody. We're just a family trying to get by. Calvin stood, facing this woman who worked 4 jobs and raised 3 children alone without ever losing her dignity. Mrs. Wright, your sons reminded me of something I'd forgotten. They showed me what true wealth looks like. It's not in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's in character, in integrity, in the choice to help someone even when there's nothing in it for you. He paused, his voice growing quieter but more intense. I built an empire. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But I lost my family chasing it. My son barely speaks to me. My wife left me years ago. I was driving alone on that highway because I had no one else to call. Ruth's expression softened with understanding. And my boys changed your tire. Your boys saved my life, Calvin corrected. Not from dying on that highway, but from dying inside without ever realizing I was already gone. The moment hung in the cold evening air, heavy with meaning. Then, unexpectedly, a car pulled up behind the convoy. A young man in his late 20s stepped out, hesitant and uncertain. He had Calvin's eyes, Calvin's strong jawline. Ethan, Calvin breathed, surprise and hope mixed in equal measure. Ethan approached slowly, taking in the scene. The construction equipment, the workers, his father standing with a poor family in the middle of an abandoned neighborhood. I got your message about the project. I wanted to see for myself. Calvin introduced his son to the Wright family, and Caleb noticed something shift in Ethan's expression as he shook their hands. It was the look of someone seeing something genuine for the first time in a long while, and not quite knowing what to make of it. These are the boys from your story? Ethan asked his father. The ones who wouldn't take money? The same, Calvin confirmed. Ethan turned to the twins, studying them with open curiosity. That true? He offered you payment and you said no? We didn't help him for money, Cameron answered simply. We helped because he needed help. Something in Ethan's face cracked open. He looked at his father, really looked at him. And what passed between them was years of pain and pride and regret, all trying to find words. Maybe I was wrong about you, Ethan said finally, his voice rough. Maybe you're not the man I thought you were. I'm trying not to be, Calvin replied. Your whole life, I taught you that everything has a price. These boys taught me I was wrong. The workers continued their tasks around them, but the world seemed to narrow down to this small circle of people. A wealthy father and his estranged son, 2 teenage boys and their struggling mother, all connected by a flat tire and a choice made in the snow. Ruth broke the spell by inviting everyone inside for coffee. It's not much, she warned, but it's warm. They crowded into the small living room, Ethan looking out of place but genuinely interested. Zara, who'd been shy until now, climbed into Calvin's lap as if she'd known him forever. He looked startled, then pleased, holding her carefully like she was made of glass. You're really the angel man, Zara said matter-of-factly. I dreamed about you before you came the first time. You had big white wings and everything. The adults laughed, and some of the tension dissolved. They talked for over an hour, about the workshop plans, about the neighborhood, about nothing and everything. Calvin described his vision for the project, how it would offer real pathways out of poverty, how it would honor the kind of work with your hands integrity that his own corporate empire had forgotten. Ethan grew more animated as he listened, ideas sparking in his eyes. You know what this needs? A digital component. Online courses, virtual mentoring, connections to apprenticeship programs nationwide. You want to help? Calvin asked, hardly daring to hope. Yeah, Ethan said, a real smile breaking across his face for the first time. Yeah, Dad. I do. As the evening wound down, Calvin stood to leave. He shrugged off his blue velvet coat and held it out to Caleb. The boy stepped back, shaking his head. I can't take that, sir. It's too expensive. That coat kept me warm the night we met, Calvin said gently. It should keep you warm now. Besides, I have plenty of others. You need it more than I do. Caleb accepted the coat with trembling hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight, but what it represented. Trust, respect, connection. Tomorrow, Calvin said, moving toward the door with Ethan beside him. We begin construction in earnest. Grand opening is planned for 3 weeks from now. I'd be honored if your family would attend. We'll be there, Ruth promised, her voice full of emotion she didn't try to hide. At the door, Calvin turned back one more time. Thank you, he said simply, for being who you are, for not changing when the world tried to make you. After they left, the Wright family stood in their small living room, processing everything that had just happened. Caleb wore Calvin's coat, far too large for him but warm as a promise. Cameron kept shaking his head in disbelief. Ruth wiped tears from her eyes while Zara chattered excitedly about the angel man. Did that really just happen? Cameron finally asked. I think it did, Caleb answered, wonder in his voice. Ruth pulled all 3 of her children close, wrapping them in her arms. God answers prayers in his own time and his own way, she whispered. We asked for warmth. He sent us a coat. We asked for help. He sent us an angel in a Rolls-Royce. And we asked for hope, and he gave us more than we ever dreamed. Outside, through the frosted windows, they could see workers still moving about, building something new in the darkness. The sound of hammers and saws rang out like a promise. The promise that tomorrow would be different, that change was possible, that one good deed really could turn a life around. The night deepened, but the lights from the construction site kept the darkness at bay. In his Rolls-Royce heading home, Calvin sat beside his son, and for the first time in years they talked without anger, without walls between them. Ethan admitted he'd judged his father too harshly. Calvin admitted he'd earned that judgment. Those boys, Ethan said quietly. They're something special. They are, Calvin agreed, and they don't even know it. That's what makes them perfect. In the back seat, Calvin's phone buzzed with messages from his board members, demanding explanations for his recent decisions. He silenced it without reading them. Some things mattered more than quarterly reports. Some investments couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. He was building a legacy. Not one made of steel and stock options, but one made of second chances and restored dignity, and the simple truth that everyone deserves a pathway up. And it had all started with 2 boys, a flat tire, and the choice to help a stranger in the snow. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of hammers and hope. The Wright family watched from their windows as the abandoned warehouse transformed day by day into something remarkable. What had been a hollow shell of broken windows and graffiti became a gleaming facility with new walls, bright lighting, and equipment that shined like promises waiting to be kept. The night before the grand opening, Ruth stood at her ironing board pressing the boys' cleanest shirts. They weren't new. The family still believed in spending money on necessities, not luxuries. But they were clean and carefully mended. Caleb and Cameron sat at the kitchen table, unusually quiet, their nervous energy filling the small room. You think there'll be a lot of people? Cameron asked, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. Mr. Langston said reporters would be there. Caleb answered, his stomach tight with anxiety. Probably business people, too. Important folks. Ruth set down her iron and came to stand between them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. Listen to me, both of you. You've spent your whole lives being invisible to people who matter. Tomorrow, people are going to see you. Really see you. Don't hide your kindness because you're afraid of attention. Let the world see what I see every single day. 2 young men of character and strength. What if we say something stupid? Cameron worried. Then you'll be human, Ruth said with a gentle smile. Nobody expects you to be perfect. They just need to see that goodness is real, that it exists outside of storybooks and Sunday sermons. Zara, already in her pajamas, tugged on Caleb's shirt. Will there be cake? The question broke the tension, and everyone laughed. Probably little bit, Caleb said, pulling her into his lap. Rich people always have cake at fancy events. Good, Zara declared with satisfaction. Angel Man promised me chocolate. Morning arrived with clear skies and winter sunshine that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. The Wright family dressed carefully, helping each other with buttons and collar adjustments. Ruth wore her best dress, 10 years old but timeless in its simple elegance. The twins wore their pressed shirts and the nicest pants they owned. Zara spun in a donated dress that Ruth had altered to fit perfectly, its blue fabric making her look like a little princess. They walked to the warehouse together, the community center that would soon be known as the Langston Mechanical Academy. Already, cars lined the street, expensive vehicles mixed with older models from neighborhood families. Someone had strung lights along the building's exterior, and a large ribbon stretched across the main entrance, waiting to be cut. As they approached, they saw the crowd gathering. At least 200 people filled the space. Reporters with cameras, suited business executives, curious neighbors, and at the center of it all, Calvin Langston in a sharp charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the morning light. He spotted them immediately and broke away from a conversation with a news anchor to meet them. The guests of honor have arrived, he announced warmly, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Mr. Langston, this is too much, Ruth protested quietly, overwhelmed by the attention. We don't need all this fuss. Today isn't about need, Calvin said gently. It's about recognition. Come, I want you to see what we've built. He led them through the crowd, and people stepped aside, their eyes following the Wright family with curiosity and something else. Respect, perhaps, or, at least, interest. Inside the warehouse, the transformation was even more stunning. State-of-the-art car lifts stood ready for use. Tool benches lined the walls, each one equipped with professional-grade equipment. Computer stations occupied one corner for the digital learning program Ethan had designed. Everything was new, clean, purposeful. This is incredible, Caleb breathed, running his hand along a workbench. His father would have loved this place. Cameron gravitated toward the car lifts, examining them with the expert eye of someone who'd worked with broken-down equipment. His whole life. These are top of the line. Mr. Henderson's shop doesn't even have lifts this nice. Ethan appeared from the office area, carrying a tablet and looking more energized than Calvin had seen him in years. Dad, the streaming setup for the online courses is ready. We can launch the virtual mentoring program as soon as you give the word. Father and son shared a look of mutual pride and understanding. 3 weeks ago, they'd barely been speaking. Now they were building something together, united by purpose, rather than divided by resentment. The ceremony began at 10 o'clock sharp. A makeshift stage had been erected near the main entrance, and someone had provided a sound system that carried voices clearly across the packed space. Calvin took the microphone first, and the crowd quieted immediately. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice steady but carrying genuine emotion. I'm not here today to talk about wealth, though I've spent most of my life accumulating it. I'm here to talk about two boys who reminded me what wealth actually means. He told the story then. The flat tire on the snowy highway, the twins' expert repair work, their refusal of payment. His words painted the picture vividly, and the audience listened with rapt attention. Cameras flashed, recording every moment. "When they wouldn't take my money," Calvin continued, his voice growing stronger. "I was confused, offended even. In my world, everything is a transaction, everything has a price. But these young men showed me that some things, integrity, kindness, dignity, those things aren't for sale." He gestured toward where the Wright family stood off to the side, trying to be inconspicuous. "Caleb and Cameron Wright taught me that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured in character, in the choice to help someone even when there's nothing in it for you, in staying true to your values even when the world offers you easier paths." The crowd erupted in applause. The twins shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of attention. Ruth squeezed their hands, anchoring them with her steady presence. "This facility," Calvin said, sweeping his arm to encompass the building, "is my attempt to honor that lesson. The Langston Mechanical Academy will provide free vocational training to any young person in this community who wants to learn. We'll offer paid apprenticeships, job placement assistance, and ongoing mentoring. Because everyone deserves a pathway up. Everyone deserves a chance." More applause, louder this time. Calvin waited for it to die down before continuing. "But a building is just walls and tools without the right foundation. That's why I'm also announcing the establishment of the Wright Family Scholarship Fund, which will provide full college tuition for students from this community who demonstrate not just academic excellence, but character and integrity." Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. The twins stared at Calvin in shock. He met their eyes and nodded slightly. This was his gift, his way of honoring them without making them uncomfortable with personal attention. "And finally," Calvin said, his voice growing softer, more personal, "I have one more announcement. Mrs. Wright, could you and your family please join me on stage?" Ruth shook her head frantically, but the crowd had already started applauding, and Calvin was gesturing them forward with such kind insistence that refusing seemed impossible. They made their way through the crowd slowly, Zara clinging to her mother's hand, the twins flanking them protectively. On stage, under the bright lights and the weight of hundreds of watching eyes, Calvin addressed Ruth directly. "You've raised two exceptional young men while working multiple jobs and fighting illness. You've taught them values that our world desperately needs more of. It's been my privilege to get to know your family these past weeks." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, but this time it didn't contain money. Instead, he pulled out a set of keys and what looked like legal documents. "3 blocks from here, there's a house that was recently renovated. 3 bedrooms, good heating, a yard for Zara to play in. It's been sitting empty, waiting for the Wright family." Calvin held out the keys to Ruth. "It's yours, fully paid for in your name. No mortgage, no rent, just a home for a family that deserves one." Ruth's legs nearly gave out. Caleb and Cameron caught their mother between them, supporting her weight as tears streamed down her face. The crowd was on its feet now, applauding and cheering. Even the reporters seemed moved, some wiping their own eyes while their cameras kept rolling. "I can't," Ruth managed to say through her tears. "Mr. Langston, I can't possibly—" "You can, and you will," Calvin said firmly but kindly. "Your boys helped a stranger without asking for anything in return. Let me return the favor. Please." Ruth looked at her sons, seeking their guidance. Both twins had tears in their eyes now, too. Caleb nodded slowly. "It's okay, Mama. This time it's okay." Ruth took the keys with shaking hands, and then, unexpectedly, she stepped forward and hugged Calvin. The gesture was so genuine, so full of gratitude and emotion, that it seemed to break something open in the billionaire. He hugged her back, this woman who'd shown him what real strength looked like, and for a moment the crowd and cameras disappeared. There were just two people connected by gratitude and grace. When they separated, Calvin had to clear his throat several times before he could continue. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice rough. "Boys, I know you didn't want to be the face of this initiative. You wanted to help without recognition. I've tried to honor that. But I do have something for you." He gestured toward the parking area, where a large cloth covered something car-shaped. Two workers pulled the cloth away, revealing a gleaming Rolls-Royce, not Calvin's personal vehicle, but a new one in deep blue. "This vehicle belongs to the Academy," Calvin explained. "It will be used for outreach programs, for transporting students to job interviews, for community engagement. But I'm giving you two the first set of keys because this journey started with a broken-down car and two boys who knew how to fix it." Caleb stepped forward suddenly, and without planning to, without thinking about the cameras or the crowd, he hugged Calvin. It was awkward and heartfelt and completely genuine. Cameron joined them a second later, and Calvin found himself wrapped in the embrace of these two young men who'd changed his entire life. "Thank you," Caleb whispered. "Thank you for not treating us like a story. Thank you for being the truth behind every story I'll ever tell," Calvin whispered back. When they finally broke apart, there wasn't a dry eye in the building. Even the hardened business executives looked moved. Ethan stood off to the side, watching his father with an expression of pure pride and understanding. This was who his father was supposed to be. This was the man he'd lost and found again. The ribbon was cut. Tours were given. The twins demonstrated their mechanical skills for impressed onlookers, explaining engine systems and repair techniques with the confidence of born teachers. Ruth spoke with reporters, her voice steady now, explaining what this opportunity meant for families like hers. Zara got her chocolate cake and shared it with anyone who wanted a bite. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Calvin pulled the Wright family aside one more time. "I want to show you the house," he said, "if you're ready." They drove there in the blue Rolls-Royce, with Caleb behind the wheel and Cameron navigating from the passenger seat. Ruth sat in back with Zara and Calvin, marveling at the leather seats and the smooth ride. The house was only 3 blocks away, but felt like a journey into a different world. It was modest by most standards, a simple 2-story home with white siding and a red door. But to the Wright family, it looked like a palace. The yard had a fence, perfect for Zara to play safely. The windows were new, the roof solid, the front porch wide enough for summer evenings and winter dreams. Inside, it was furnished simply but completely. A real kitchen with modern appliances, a living room with comfortable couches, 3 bedrooms upstairs, each one painted in warm, welcoming colors. The heating system worked perfectly, filling every room with comfortable warmth. Ruth moved through the house slowly, touching walls and door frames like she couldn't quite believe they were real. The boys explored with growing excitement, finding a basement workshop that would be perfect for practicing their mechanical skills. Zara claimed the smallest bedroom immediately, spinning in circles and declaring herself a princess in a castle. "How?" Ruth finally asked Calvin, who'd been watching their reactions from the doorway. "How does someone I barely know change my entire life?" Calvin smiled softly. "Because your sons changed mine first. This is just things, Mrs. Wright, walls and furniture and heating systems. What they gave me was infinitely more valuable. They gave me back my purpose, my son, my humanity." He pulled out one more envelope, and Ruth almost laughed through her tears. "More surprises? Last one, I promise. This contains the deed to the house, all the utility setup information, and a bank account in your name with enough money to cover property taxes and maintenance for the next 10 years. I don't want you worrying about keeping this place." I want you healing and watching your children thrive." Ruth opened her mouth to protest, but Calvin held up a hand. "Before you say no, remember, your boys taught me that accepting help with grace is just as important as giving it. Let me do this. Please." Ruth looked at the envelope, at this man who'd become so much more than a stranger they'd helped on a highway. "On one condition," she said finally. "You come to dinner every Sunday. You and your son. Family dinner, nothing fancy. Just us being grateful together." Calvin's eyes glistened. "I would be honored." The scene faded to black. A perfect ending. But endings are just beginnings in disguise. 1 year later, winter returned to the small town with fresh snow and familiar cold. The Langston Mechanical Academy thrived, its classrooms full of eager students learning trades that would support them for life. The Wright house glowed with light and laughter, a home in every sense of the word. Caleb and Cameron, now 15, had become assistant instructors at the academy, teaching younger students the skills their father had passed down to them. They excelled in school, their names on the honor roll every semester. College acceptance letters had started arriving, scholarships attached to each one. Ruth's health had stabilized completely. With proper medication, good nutrition, and the absence of crushing stress, she'd regained the strength and vitality that poverty had stolen. She still worked, but now she chose her jobs rather than being desperate for any work available. She coordinated the Academy's community outreach program, connecting families with resources and opportunities. Zara was thriving in 3rd grade, no longer the quiet, hungry child who'd slept through dinner. She had friends, confidence, and a bedroom full of books she'd read cover to cover. Calvin had stepped down from his position as CEO of Langston Industries, choosing philanthropy over profit margins. He and Ethan had fully reconciled, working side by side on charitable initiatives across the country. They came to Sunday dinners at the Wright house religiously, both men having found in this adopted family the connection they'd lost in their own. On this particular winter morning, the Academy held its annual scholarship ceremony. The building was packed again, but this time with familiar faces, students who'd completed their training, families who'd been lifted up, community members who'd watched the transformation firsthand. A mural had been painted on the main wall, depicting 2 boys changing a tire in the snow. Underneath, in elegant script, were the words, "One good deed can turn a life around." Caleb stood before the mural, studying it as he had many times before. The artist had captured something essential, not just the physical act of helping, but the spirit behind it. The way they'd approached the car with both hope and fear. The moment of decision to help, despite the risk of rejection. "Still weird seeing yourself on a wall?" Cameron asked, joining his brother. "Every time," Caleb admitted. "But I guess if it inspires one person to help someone else, it's worth being uncomfortable." The ceremony began with Ethan at the podium, introducing the scholarship recipients. 20 students from the academy were receiving full rides to various colleges and trade schools, their paths forward secured by the fund Calvin had established in the Wright family's name. Then something unexpected happened. Calvin took the microphone and called Caleb and Cameron to the stage. The twins exchanged confused glances but complied, climbing the stairs to uncertain applause. "These young men," Calvin began, "started this journey by refusing payment for a simple act of kindness. Today, I'm offering them something I hope they won't refuse, the keys to this academy's future." He held out a set of keys, different from the car keys he'd given them a year ago. "When you both graduate high school, I want you to run this place. Not as employees, but as co-directors. This is your community. These are your people. Nobody understands what they need better than you do." Caleb and Cameron stood speechless. Finally, Caleb found his voice. "Mr. Langston, we're just kids. We don't know how to run something this big. You'll learn. I'll teach you. Ethan will teach you. And more importantly, you already understand what this place is really about. Not job training or statistics, but dignity, opportunity, hope. Calvin's voice grew stronger. You gave me a second chance at being human. Let me give you the tools to offer that same chance to others. The twins looked at each other, that wordless communication passing between them. Then, simultaneously, they nodded. We'll do it, Cameron said. Together. The crowd erupted. Ruth stood in the front row, tears of pride streaming down her face. This was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just getting by, but thriving. After the ceremony, Calvin suggested one more drive. Just like old times, he said, though times were very different now. They piled into the blue Rolls-Royce, the same one from the grand opening, now used weekly for academy business. Caleb drove, Cameron navigated, and Calvin sat in back with a contentment he'd never known in his years of corporate success. Take us to where we met, Calvin requested quietly. Caleb knew exactly where he meant. He drove carefully through the snowy streets, out past the town limits to that stretch of rural highway where everything had changed. The road looked the same, empty, cold, forgotten by most of the world. He pulled over at the approximate spot where Calvin's Rolls-Royce had sat stranded a year ago. They all climbed out, standing in the snow, breath fogging in the cold air. Right here, Calvin said, his voice full of wonder. Right here, two boys decided to help a stranger, and everything changed. We were scared, Caleb admitted. Thought you might yell at us, call the police, think we were trying to rob you. I almost did, Calvin confessed. I was so trapped in my own fear and cynicism that I almost missed the greatest gift I've ever received. Cameron kicked at the snow, a grin spreading across his face. Crazy how things work out, huh? Last year we were pushing a cart full of scrap metal down this road. Now we're standing here in a Rolls-Royce we get to drive. Now you're standing here as the future directors of an institution that's going to change thousands of lives, Calvin corrected. The car is just a tool. You're the real gift. They stood there for a few more minutes, letting the moment sink in. The snow fell softly, covering the road in fresh white, the same way it had a year ago. But everything else was different. Everything else had transformed. As they drove back toward town, Cameron said what they were all thinking. This time, we're the ones offering the ride. Calvin smiled from the back seat. You've been offering the ride all along. I was just lucky enough to accept it. The Rolls-Royce disappeared into the snowy distance, its taillights growing smaller until they were just red dots against the white landscape. Behind them, the road stretched empty and cold. But ahead, warmth and light and purpose waited. In the ride home that evening, the family gathered for dinner as they did every night. The table was full. Good food, growing children, laughter that came easy now. Ruth said grace, thanking God for angels in unexpected forms and for sons who'd never forgotten who they were. Across town, Calvin and Ethan sat in their own home, also sharing a meal, also grateful. Father and son talked about the academy's expansion plans, about the lives being changed, about the legacy they were building together. And somewhere in the academy's office, a framed photograph hung on the wall. It showed two teenage boys and a billionaire, arms around each other, all three smiling like family. Underneath, Calvin had written in his elegant handwriting, "Kindness doesn't go unnoticed. It just takes time to find its way home." The story had come full circle, from a broken car to a fixed life, from a moment of compassion to a movement of change. And it had started with the simplest thing. Two boys who chose to help because it was right, not because it would be rewarded. That choice echoed forward, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, touching lives they'd never meet, inspiring acts of kindness they'd never witness. But somewhere in the cold and the snow, on forgotten highways and in struggling homes, people would remember this story. And maybe, just maybe, they'd stop to help the next stranded stranger they encountered. Because one good deed really can turn a life around. Sometimes it turns many lives around. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it turns the whole world just a little bit brighter. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. If you had the chance to help someone who could change your life forever, but you had no way of knowing it, would you still stop, or would you keep walking? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us what it truly means to be human.